Before he became a Wall Street titan, Daniel Drew was a young man from Putnam County, New York, who started his career driving cattle. To increase his profits, he began purchasing cattle in Ohio, necessitating arduous drives over the Allegheny Mountains, a journey fraught with peril. This is his first-hand account of the physical endurance required to survive these treacherous early business ventures. The man who would later wage war with Cornelius Vanderbilt for control of the nation's railroads began his career with a $1,000 loan and a herd of beef. He wasn't moving stocks, he was moving livestock. And his first major trade required him to personally walk them 300 miles over a mountain range with no guarantee of survival, let alone profit. Every dollar of his future was tied to the health of animals that could break a leg, sicken, or be lost in a storm. This was finance at its most elemental, a contest against mud, weather, and exhaustion, where the ledger was written in lost weight and dead cattle. The cunning he later deployed in boardrooms was forged here on the trail. This is not a history lesson. This is his private recollection of the ordeal that taught him his first and most lasting lesson in speculation. Act 2. Arc 1. The Astor Loan.
A man's fortune begins not with the first dollar he earns, but with the first dollar he risks. Before I ever saw the inside of the stock exchange, my entire world was the Bull's Head Tavern and the cattle yards of New York. I was a drover, a man who bought and sold livestock. It was an honest trade, but a small one. The cattle came from nearby. The profits were slim, and the ceiling on a man's ambition was low. I saw the city growing, and with it, its hunger. The demand for beef was insatiable, yet the supply was local, and therefore limited. The farmers of Putnam County and Westchester could only raise so many head. The real opportunity, I reasoned, lay further west. Out in Ohio, the pastures were endless and the cattle were cheap. The question was not one of supply, but of transport. Between cheap Ohio cattle and hungry New York butchers stood the Allegheny Mountains, a formidable barrier. Other drovers considered it impassable for a large herd. They spoke of the trails as graveyards for livestock, where a man could lose his entire investment to a single blizzard or a rock slide. They were content with their small, safe profits. I was not. To undertake such a venture required capital I did not possess. I had a reputation for being shrewd and reliable, but a reputation does not fill a purse. There was one man in New York who understood risk, a man who had built an empire from nothing, John Jacob Astor. But he was a fur trader, not a cattleman. I went to see his brother, Henry Astor, a butcher by trade, and a man who understood the value of a steady supply of beef. I laid out my plan for him. I did not speak of hopes or possibilities. I spoke of numbers. The cost of a steer in Ohio versus its sale price in New York. The estimated losses on the trail, factored in as a business expense. I presented the mountain not as an obstacle, but as a barrier to entry that kept our competition away. He listened, his face unreadable. He had heard 100 schemes from 100 young men. I told him I needed $1,000, a considerable sum. He asked what collateral I could offer. I told him I had none but my name and my conviction. I could see the refusal forming on his lips, so I added one more thing. I told him I would walk with the herd myself. every step. My own survival would be tied to the survival of his investment. He was silent for a long time. Then he nodded, once. He was not lending to the plan. He was lending to the man. He agreed to the $1,000. I walked out of his shop with the money, and the weight of it was heavier than any physical burden. It was the weight of another man's trust. The gamble was no longer just an idea on a map. It was real. Arc 2. The Long March West. The journey to Ohio was one of solitude and calculation. I traveled light and fast, on horseback and by coach, my mind consumed with the logistics of what was to come. I was not a tourist admiring the landscape. I was a general surveying the terrain of a future campaign. Every river was a potential crossing problem. Every town a place to secure provisions. Every stretch of wilderness a threat. When I arrived in the Ohio Valley, it was as I had imagined. The land was rich, and the cattle were plentiful and cheap. Local farmers, with no easy access to the eastern markets, were happy to sell for a fraction of the New York price. I spent weeks moving from farm to farm, a process that required a different kind of shrewdness. You must have an eye for livestock to see past a well-fed appearance to the strength of the animal's constitution. A weak steer might look fine in the pasture, but it will be the first to fall on a mountain trail. I was not buying pets. I was buying assets. Each one had to be capable of enduring a 300-mile journey. I chose older, hardier animals, ones with lean frames and clear eyes. I assembled a herd of 100 head. To the local farmers, I was just another New York buyer. They did not know the journey I intended to put these animals through. I hired a small crew of drovers, tough men who knew the work. But I was the one in charge. My $1,000, Astor's $1,000, was walking on 400 hooves. On the first day we set out, the reality of the task began to settle in. 100 animals create a river of flesh, with a mind of its own. It moves at its own pace. It is stubborn, skittish, and requires constant vigilance. The first week was deceptively simple. We moved across the flatlands of Ohio, making good time. The cattle grazed as they walked, and the rhythm of the drive was established. Dawn to dusk, we walked. At night, we made camp, taking turns to watch the herd. The fire was our only comfort against the growing autumn chill. Around it, the other men would talk and joke. I remained quiet, my mind on the map, on the mountains that loomed larger in my imagination with each passing day. They saw a herd of cattle. I saw a column of figures in a ledger. Each animal had a cost. The provisions for the men had a cost. Time itself had a cost. The longer we were on the trail, the more weight the cattle would lose, and the lower their price at market. This was a race against time and nature, and we had not yet even reached the starting line of the true test. The men grew confident. They said we were making fine progress. I said nothing. I knew that the flat land was a deception. It was lulling us into a false sense of security. The mountain was waiting, and a mountain does not care about a man's confidence. Arc 3. The Allegheny Crucible. The ascent began. The trail narrowed. winding its way through dense, dark forests. The ground, which had been soft earth, became a treacherous mix of rock and mud. The broad, slow-moving river of cattle was compressed into a thin, struggling line. The pace slowed to a crawl. The animals, used to open pasture, grew agitated and difficult to manage. This was where the weak began to fail. A steer with a hidden ailment, one I had missed in my inspection, would suddenly falter. It would lie down and refuse to get up. There was nothing to be done. We could not stop the entire herd for one animal. We had to leave it behind. The first time it happened, a silence fell over the men. They understood. The mountain was beginning to take its toll. Each animal left behind was a piece of Astor's money, a piece of my future, abandoned on the trail. I kept a running tally in my head. 1 steer down, 99 to go. Then another stumbled, breaking a leg on a loose rock. 2 down. The numbers were cold and brutal. The easy confidence of the flatlands was a distant memory. Now, there was only the grind. Then the weather turned. A cold autumn rain began to fall, relentless and chilling. It turned the paths into slick channels of mud. The cattle slid and struggled. The men were soaked through, their hands numb, their spirits sinking. The nights were worse. The campfire sputtered in the rain, offering little warmth. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the sounds of the miserable, shifting herd. We lost 3 more cattle in one night to sickness brought on by the cold and wet. 5 down. I could feel the profit margin shrinking with every loss. But then, something worse happened. A clap of thunder in the dead of night. Not just a rumble, but a sharp, violent crack that echoed through the valleys. The herd, already on edge, exploded. It was chaos. A stampede in the mountains, in the dark, is a drover's worst nightmare. You cannot see. You cannot think. You can only react. We spent the rest of the night and all of the next day gathering the scattered animals. We rode through treacherous terrain, shouting ourselves hoarse, trying to find them. When we finally took a count, we were missing a dozen more. 17. 17 head lost, nearly a fifth of my investment, gone. The men were demoralized. They spoke of turning back. They said the drive was cursed. I let them talk. I felt the pull of despair myself. It would have been easy to give in, to cut my losses and admit defeat. But then I thought of Henry Astor's $1,000. I thought of the smirks on the faces of the other drovers back in New York if I returned empty-handed. I gathered the men. I did not shout. I spoke quietly. I told them that the mountain had taken its payment. Now we would pay it no more. We would get the rest of this herd to New York if we had to carry them on our backs. My resolve silenced their complaints. They saw that I would not break. And so, they would not break either. The crucible of the mountain was not over, but it had forged us into a harder, more determined unit. We pushed on. Arc 4. The Salt Trick. After the peak, the descent was, in its own way, as dangerous as the climb. The cattle were weak, their legs unsteady. A misplaced step could send an animal tumbling. The men were exhausted, running on sheer nerve. But the sight of the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, of civilization gave us a new strength. The worst was behind us. We left the mountains and entered the more forgiving landscape of eastern Pennsylvania. The trails widened. There were pastures where the cattle could rest and graze. But the damage was done. I looked at my herd. They were no longer the strong, healthy animals I had bought in Ohio. They were gaunt, their ribs showing. They had survived, but they had shed pounds, and pounds were money. I did the math in my head again and again as we walked. With 17 head lost completely, and the remaining 83 underweight, my profit was gone. In fact, I stood to lose money. I would be lucky to break even and repay Astor his loan. The thought was galling. To have endured so much, to have pushed men and beasts to their absolute limit, only to fail. Failure was not an outcome I was prepared to accept. My mind, sharpened by the desperation of the trail, began to work on the problem. I was not selling meat by the pound on the butcher's scale. I was selling live cattle to the butchers at the Bull's Head. They would assess the animals by eye. A steer that looked plump and heavy would fetch a higher price than one that looked thin and worn. The actual weight was secondary to the perceived weight. The problem, then, was not weight, but appearance. An idea began to form. An old drover's trick, one that most considered a form of low cunning. But I was not in a position to be concerned with niceties. I was concerned with survival. The day before we were to arrive at the market, I had my men drive the herd into a dry pasture. I had purchased several large blocks of salt. I ordered the men to deny the cattle water, but to give them all the salt they would lick. The animals, starved for salt after the long journey, consumed it greedily. They became intensely, painfully thirsty. For the rest of the day and through the night, we gave them no water. It was a cruel necessity. The lowing of the herd was a sound of deep thirst. My men were uneasy. This was not normal practice, but they followed my orders. On the morning of the sale, just before we began the final leg of the journey to the market, I gave the order. We let the herd down to a stream. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The desperately thirsty animals drank and drank, their sides swelling with the sheer volume of water they consumed. They bloated themselves, filling their bellies with dozens of pounds of worthless liquid. Within an hour, my herd was transformed. The gaunt, trail-worn beasts now appeared full, heavy, and healthy. They looked to a casual observer like they had just come from a rich pasture. The water had added no value, no meat, no fat. But it had added the appearance of value. And at the market, appearance was everything. I had watered my stock. It was a lesson I would never forget. Arc 5. The Day of Reckoning. We arrived at the Bull's Head market. It was a maelstrom of activity. Butchers in bloody aprons moved through the pens, inspecting the livestock with critical eyes. Other drovers, the ones who had stayed close to home, watched our arrival with curiosity. They saw a herd that had come all the way from Ohio over the mountains, yet appeared remarkably well fed. They were impressed, or perhaps suspicious. It did not matter. The key was to sell them quickly. The water would not stay in them forever. I moved through the crowd, engaging the buyers I knew. I did not wait for them to come to me. I spoke of the quality of Ohio cattle, of their superior breeding. I named my price, a confident, firm price that reflected the apparent quality of the animals before them, not the ordeal they had suffered. One by one, the sales were made. The butchers, judging by sight, were satisfied. They saw heavy animals and paid a heavy price. They did not know they were paying for gallons of river water. They were buying a perception, an illusion I had carefully crafted out of desperation. I sold the last of the 83 head by midday. As my men led the last of the sold cattle away, I stood back and counted my earnings. I had the cash in my hand. I walked directly from the market to Henry Astor's butcher shop. He was in the middle of his work. I did not say a word. I simply walked to his counter and laid out $1,000, plus the interest we had agreed upon. He counted it slowly. He looked at the money, then up at me. My clothes were torn and filthy from the trail. I was thinner, and my face was weathered. But I had returned, and I had paid my debt. He nodded and said, "You did well, boy." That was all, but it was enough. After paying Astor, and my men, and all the expenses of the journey, I was left with a significant profit. Far more than I would have made in a year of local trading. I had started with $1,000 of borrowed money and 100 head of cattle. I had returned with 83 head and a lesson worth more than all of them. I had learned that in business, reality is not always what matters most. What matters is what people believe to be real. What matters is the story you can sell. The water in the cattle was worthless, but the belief it created was not. Act 3.
Daniel Drew never forgot the lesson of the Allegheny Trail. The principle of watering stock, inflating the perceived value of an asset just before the sale, became his signature move. He would later apply the same logic, not to cattle, but to the shares of the Erie Railroad, issuing millions in new stock certificates to dilute the value and thwart the takeover attempts of his rival Cornelius Vanderbilt. The brutal education in risk, leverage, and deception he received as a young drover became the foundation of a Wall Street fortune and a career that would define the ruthless speculation of the Gilded Age. This is not a history lesson. This is Henry Clews' private account of the men who built and nearly broke modern finance.
The Erie Railroad War. The great wars of our age were not all fought on the battlefield. Some of the most brutal were waged in the quiet, carpeted offices of Lower Manhattan with ink and paper for ammunition. The battle for the Erie Railroad was perhaps the most spectacular of them all, a contest of titans that shook the foundations of the market. On one side stood Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore. He was a man of blunt force and immense will, accustomed to taking what he wanted, and he had decided he wanted the Erie. His strategy was simple: buy every share of Erie stock available. He would create a corner, forcing anyone who had sold shares short to buy them back from him at his price, giving him total control. He poured millions into the effort, his brokers sweeping the floor of the exchange, buying, always buying. The price of Erie stock began to climb, from 50 to 60, then 70. The Commodore was relentless, but Vanderbilt had not accounted for the peculiar genius of his adversary, Daniel Drew. Uncle Daniel, as he was known, was a director of the Erie, and he viewed the railroad not as a public trust, but as his private treasury. While Vanderbilt bought up the existing shares, Drew, along with his young protégés Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, simply created more. They found a clause in the Erie's charter that allowed them to convert bonds into stock. So they did. In the dead of night they used a hand-cranked printing press kept for this very purpose. For every share Vanderbilt's agents bought, Drew and his confederates printed a new one to sell. The Commodore was buying into a flood. His brokers reported that the more they bought, the more shares seemed to appear, as if from thin air. The price wavered, then began to fall, as the market was inundated with this phantom stock. Vanderbilt was trapped. He had spent millions, and for nothing. He was furious. He went to the courts, securing an injunction against the Erie directors for their illegal issue of stock. But Drew and his partners were a step ahead. Hearing the warrant for their arrest was issued, they gathered up the company's books, the corporate seal, and approximately $6 million in cash, proceeds from their sales to Vanderbilt. They fled across the Hudson River to New Jersey, beyond the jurisdiction of the New York courts. They set up a government in exile in a hotel in Jersey City, which they promptly fortified with armed guards and even a small cannon. From this new headquarters, which the papers mockingly called Fort Taylor, they continued to run the Erie Railroad, thumbing their noses at the most powerful man in America. The great Commodore Vanderbilt had been bled dry and humiliated by a cattle drover and two upstarts. It was a lesson the street never forgot. The rules were only for those who couldn't afford to break them, and the value of a thing was only what someone was willing to pay for it, until the printing presses started rolling. 2. The panic on the floor. There is a particular sound to a panic. It is not just the shouting, but the quality of the sound. A high, thin note of animal fear that cuts through the roar of the trading floor. I have heard it more than once. The worst was in '73. It began with the failure of J. Cook and Company. Cook was a titan, the man who had financed the Union's war effort. His bank was considered as solid as the United States Treasury itself. When the news of his firm's suspension was announced on the floor, there was a moment of absolute silence. It was the silence of disbelief, the silence of a man watching the ground open up beneath his feet. Then the dam broke. The sound that followed was not human. It was a single, collective howl of ruin. Men who had been millionaires at breakfast were paupers by lunch. They swarmed the posts, desperate to sell, but there were no buyers. None. The bid for even the most stable stocks had simply vanished. The price of Lake Shore, a Vanderbilt stock, fell from 90 to 50 in 15 minutes. I saw a man I knew, a respectable broker named Anthony, climb onto a bench and tear at his collar, screaming, "I am ruined! I am ruined!" until his friends pulled him down. He had been worth $500,000 that morning. The governors of the exchange, seeing the utter collapse, took an unprecedented step. For the first time in its history, they voted to close the New York Stock Exchange. The bell rang, and a funereal silence fell. But the panic did not stop. It spilled out onto the street. A crowd gathered on Wall Street and Broad, a mob of investors, messengers, and ruined speculators, all staring up at the closed doors of the exchange as if it were a tomb. They say 10,000 men were ruined that week. Firms that had stood for 50 years were wiped out in an afternoon. The credit system that pinpoints our entire economy simply ceased to exist. In the days that followed, the city was a ghost town. The great hotels were empty, the theaters dark. The only busy places were the ferry terminals, as men fled the city and the debts they could no longer pay. I saw the great operators then, the men who had weathered the storm. They walked through the wreckage with a calm that was almost unnerving. For them, a panic is not a disaster. It is an opportunity. While others were selling everything they owned, these men were quietly buying. They purchased railroads, banks, and entire industries for pennies on the dollar from the hands of ruined men. A panic cleanses the market of weakness. It transfers wealth from the fearful to the nerveless. It is a brutal but necessary part of the cycle. A forest fire that clears the dead wood and allows for new growth. But I will never forget the smell of the smoke. 3. The operator's mind. The public sees Wall Street as a grand casino, and the men who work there as mere gamblers. They are not entirely wrong, but they miss the essential distinction. A gambler plays a game of chance. A great operator, a speculator, plays a game of calculated probability, psychology, and nerve. I knew them all. Drew, Gould, Fisk, Vanderbilt. Each had his own method, but they all shared certain qualities. The first was an almost inhuman ability to divorce emotion from their decisions. The average man buys when stocks are rising, caught up in the optimism. He sells when they are falling, infected by the panic. He follows the crowd. The operator does the opposite. Vanderbilt once told a young broker, "Never tell anybody what you're going to do till you've done it." Secrecy was paramount. The moment your intentions are known, you become prey. They were masters of information, not just the numbers on the tape, but the whispers in the corridors, the financial health of their rivals, the personal weaknesses of the men on the other side of a trade. Jay Gould had a network of telegraph operators who would give him news hours before it reached the public. This information gave them an edge, but the true battle was internal. It was the ability to hold a massive position with millions of dollars at risk and sleep soundly at night. It was the nerve to add to your position when the world was screaming at you to sell. I have seen men with brilliant minds utterly destroyed by a lack of nerve. They analyze correctly. They predict the market's turn. But at the moment of truth, they flinch. They cannot bear the pressure of being wrong, even for a day. The great operator, however, has a profound confidence in his own judgment that borders on arrogance. He must. He is betting not just on the stock, but on his own superior understanding of the world. This is why they are often lonely men. They cannot trust the opinions of others, the chatter of the street, the advice of friends. The headlines in the papers, it is all noise, designed to mislead the herd. The final decision is made in silence and in solitude. It is the loneliest kind of courage, to stand against the tide of human emotion, to bet everything you have on your own conviction, and to wait. That is not gambling. That is war. And it takes a certain kind of general to win.
Henry Clews continues to operate his brokerage house, Henry Clews & Co., through booms and panics for another 3 decades, becoming one of the most respected and feared figures on the street. The Gilded Age he chronicled eventually gave way to regulation and reform. But the psychological dramas he described, the greed, the fear, the intoxicating allure of risk, remain the unchanged bedrock of the market. The archive holds another voice, from another world built on risk and reward, a Venetian merchant's account of 24 years in the courts of Kublai Khan. Click here to hear the travels of Marco Polo.